we're next going to have Christina Badaracco join us, who is a healthcare consultant, registered dietitian, and co-author of the Farm Bill, A Citizen's Guide. So the Farm Bill is a piece of legislation that comes up every 5 years, and it is very connected to the work that we are all doing as it funds many of the programs that we work under, and it's connected to the National Strategy on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health as well. So Christina's going to give us an overview and help us to understand how this connects to the work that we do at the local community level. So Christina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for including me in the discussion today. I'm really excited to get to be with you all virtually. So I'm going to be helping to provide some context for today's discussions, giving an overview of the Farm Bill and its effects on local communities and the work that some of you are doing. So brief outline, again, I'll start off with an overview of the Farm Bill, go over its structure, history, recent updates, and some of its far-reaching effects, and then spend just a couple of slides talking specifically about nutrition and some considerations for optimizing nutrition through SNAP, some recent issues that are likely to affect the 2023 Farm Bill, and then end with some recommendations for positive change. Again, really looking at some of the work that you all are doing or could be doing. Okay, so to start off with some of the history and context, just as a reminder, for the process of writing and signing a new Farm Bill. So roughly every 5 to 7 years, Congress develops a new Farm Bill. So the House and the Senate each create a draft version of the Farm Bill, each of these ag committees. Each chamber will debate, amend, and then vote on that bill. And then they'll work together, form a conference committee to combine those bills. The full House and Senate can then vote on that final bill, and then it's sent to the White House for the president's signature. So as I said, that happens roughly every 5 to 7 years in the US. And the last Farm Bill was signed at the very end of 2018 and is set to expire in, I guess just about 2 weeks, end of September. So we are due to sign a new Farm Bill this year. In addition to that authorization process that happens every 5 to 7 years, so signing the new Farm Bill, writing what is covered by each of the programs, that's the process of authorization. Something called appropriations also happens every year. So there are certain programs within the Farm Bill. There are all sorts of other programs even outside of the Farm Bill that are subject to annual appropriations that decide what programs are going to receive how much money. So regardless of how much money each Farm Bill authorizes for certain programs, that may or may not end up being the exact amount of money that will be appropriated each year. And so if we want to be able to figure out how much money over the course of a Farm Bill is spent in total at the programs, we can only really have a general estimate if we look at the time the bill was signed and we think about the next 5 years. But looking back to be able to sum up what was appropriated each year can give us an idea of what is truly being spent across all of the programs. So the Farm Bill consists of 12 titles. A title is essentially a category of programs that are included in the Farm Bill. And so I'm going to, for just a couple of slides, talk through in particular some of the bigger programs, or excuse me, bigger titles. If we imagine the Farm Bill as a dollar, the image you can see on the slide gives you an idea of what proportion is spent on each of those titles. And I'm going to certainly talk about this more, but nutrition is by far the largest title, which many of you may know, followed by crop insurance, conservation, and commodities. And altogether, those 4 titles make up more than 99% of the spending through the Farm Bill. And then there are another 8 titles, which I'll talk about briefly. So this is a graph that shows spending on those top 4 titles over the last few decades. This was the most recent version of this graph I could find from the Congressional Research Service. So I think the last several years are still estimates. But there are a couple of things I want to point out in this graph. So I guess one that really stands out is we can see the gray bars for the nutrition title are by far the largest proportion, as I said before, but that proportion has increased, and there are a couple points in time where the increase has been more notable. So one would be around 2008, coming out of the Great Recession, when there were for a couple of different reasons, increases in spending on the SNAP program. And then I guess because this graph was made before a lot of the pandemic emergency assistance, we can't see on this graph, but there is also going to be a very substantial increase in funding within just the last couple of years. Something else I'll point out is if you look at the yellow and blue bars for the crop insurance and commodity programs, there's been a little bit of a shift over the last couple of decades in which of those has been more prominent in terms of subsidizing our agricultural system in the US. So a few decades ago, crop insurance was very, very small. We didn't spend, there was a very small proportion of the Farm Bill spent on crop insurance subsidies, whereas the commodity programs were much larger. But over the last couple of decades, crop insurance, and I'll talk a little bit more what is included in that title in a moment, has become a more prominent way of subsidizing agriculture. And I'll also talk about in a moment why that matters, why that might be concerning. So here's just another way to help visualize the size of the different titles in the Farm Bill. And so this was the projected spending at the time the Farm Bill was authorized at the very end of 2019. And so as you can see, this says nutrition 76%. We've ended up spending even more than that. But once again, we see that these top 4 titles make up more than 99% of the spending. Okay, so to spend just a minute looking at the top 4 titles. So nutrition, as I said, is the largest. That might be the one that you all are most familiar with as well. And so the largest program within this largest title is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, but it's not the only one. There are a few others. To offer just a few examples, we have the Emergency Food Assistance Program, Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program, and the Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Program, or GUSNIP, which you may have heard about. And so all of these programs are different mechanisms for providing nutrition assistance to low-income households throughout the US. Okay, and then I won't spend too much time on these, but just to take a brief look at some of the other 3 largest titles. So we have crop insurance, which is second largest, and that primarily consists of the federal crop insurance program. So this is a way for farmers to help to mitigate their risk. So the federal government does subsidize crop insurance for farmers, but they still are paying a certain amount of their premium to be able to utilize these plans. And then there are a few other programs included in this title as well. For example, Stacked Income Protection Plan. And then there's another one called the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Program. So I'll come back to that a little bit later as well. But that's a very important program because it's really one of the only mechanisms in this title that can support farms that are producing a variety of products, maybe crops as well as livestock, and can be suitable for diversified agricultural systems, as opposed to monocultures or farms that have maybe just a couple of types of crops that they're growing. Then we also have the commodities title. So that is going to provide support through a few different mechanisms to cover types of crops we call commodities. And if you're not too familiar with that term, That refers to types of crops that are typically grown in very large quantity, can be used for a variety of purposes. We often use them in trade, and think of things like corn, soy, wheat, rice, barley, peanuts, cotton, etc. And the two most prominent programs in that title are the price loss coverage and agricultural risk coverage. And so these are really helping to provide subsidies to help cover low prices and low revenue for farmers. And then there are a couple other programs as well, dairy margin coverage, marketing assistance loans, et cetera. And then the fourth largest title, we have conservation. And so this includes a variety of different programs. Generally speaking, they fall under the conservation programs fall under three different categories. One is what is considered a working lands program, so something like the EQIP or Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And so that would be a source of funding for farmers who are implementing conservation practices on land that they are actively farming. Whereas another category called a set-aside program, an example being the Conservation Reserve Program, is where farmers are actually incentivized to set aside a portion of their farmland for a period of time. And that can be important to help let the nutrients in the soil regenerate, essentially give the land time to refresh so that it's not just being actively used and farmed continually. And then increasingly, in the last couple of farm bills, we see more focus on easement. So one example being the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program. And so that's another type of mechanism to incentivize conservation. And I think I'll talk in a few slides about a little bit of a shift that we've seen over time in the way that these different categories are funded as well. Okay, and then the other 8 titles, again, less than 1% of the Farm Bill, include trade. So that is support for programs to help with exports to other countries, a little bit for international food aid. And then we have a credit title, so that supports loans for farmers and ranchers. We have a rural development title, so that supports rural business, community development. There's a research title that provides funding for research, often through extension programs in the United States. We have a forestry title that supports forestry management, an energy title, so that supports on-farm sustainable energy production, horticulture, and I'll pause on that title for just a minute because that is a title that includes grants for what are considered specialty crops, if you haven't heard that term before. So specialty crops would be the term used to describe things like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, the types of foods that any of us who work in the field of nutrition are typically recommending are filling up people's plates. So those specialty crop block grants fall under the horticulture title. And then also the support for organic agriculture. So things like cost sharing assistance for farmers to convert to organic, for example. And then there's a miscellaneous title. So as the name would imply, it is quite miscellaneous. So there's a little bit of support for livestock producers, what has been an increasing focus in the last couple of farm bills, support for beginning, disadvantaged, and veteran farmers. And there are a variety of other smaller programs covered by that title as well. Okay, so on this slide, I'm just going to show you kind of big picture. I'm not certainly going to go through every single farm bill, but to show you the history of farm bills in the United States. So the very first farm bill was signed into law in 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and that was signed at a period in time coming out of the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression. It was signed as part of the New Deal. And then we've had another farm bill, generally speaking, every 5 to 7 years since then. And as I said before, the most recent one was signed into law at the end of 2019. That was called the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018. I just wanted to point out a couple of notable changes over time. And by no means does that mean these are the only changes. There are certainly lots of changes, Farm Bill to Farm Bill, but just to call out a couple of notable points in particular, perhaps for this group. So in the 1970s, we saw that food stamps, what were formerly called food stamps, became a permanent part of the Farm Bill. That was not the first time they were created and used, but that was the first time they became a permanent program funded through the Farm Bill. In the 1980s, we saw the conservation title added. In the early 2000s, we saw the beginning of requirements for SNAP Ed or the SNAP education programs. And then we saw the beginning of funds for nutrition incentives in the 2014 Farm Bill. And then a few examples of changes that we saw in the 2018 Farm Bill. And some of you may already know about some of these if you were working in the field at the time. But one was that actually this Farm Bill legalized hemp production in the United States. It also made a couple of programs permanent. So when a program becomes permanent, by the way, that means it will be included in every subsequent Farm Bill. So the Farming Opportunities Training and Outreach and the Local Agriculture Marketing Program. We saw some small improvements to the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Program that I mentioned before in the insurance title. Increased funding for SNAP employment and training. We saw that the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program, or FINI is the acronym, was permanently funded. Was also renamed the GusNet program. And as a small aside, it had the beginnings of what are called nutrition prescriptions. I believe there were $25 million set aside within that title to be used for nutrition prescriptions in particular. We saw increased funding for organic research and cost sharing, but also a reduction in terms of the restrictions on what chemicals can be used in organic agriculture. We saw a redesigned dairy margin coverage program. Many of you may be aware of a lot of the challenges in particular that have faced the dairy industry in recent years with consolidation, farms going out of business for a variety of reasons. And then the last point here, so we did see an expanded definition of the family members who are eligible to receive commodity payments. And so you may have heard that referred to as the 23andMe rule. So opening up the ability to receive payments even for family members who are very, very distantly related. And so while some positive changes were made, overall, the 2018 Farm Bill was largely considered a status quo bill. So for the next series of slides, I want to walk through some examples of, again, sort of the far-reaching effects. So what are the different impacts on society, on the environment, on public health, on the economy, et cetera, of what you just heard, of the way that the Farm Bill supports certain types of agriculture, spends money on certain types of programs. So on this first slide, I want to show that we've had within the last, what is this? I guess about 70 years, 60 to 70 years, a substantial change in the number and size of farms in the United States. So looking at the black line, we can see, and the axis on the left side of this graph, a very significant decrease in the number of farms in the United States. So, and I believe that last I checked, the current number of farms still stands at about 2 million. So we've had a very significant decrease in the number of farms, but at the same time, the size of farms has gotten much larger. So we have fewer smaller and mid-sized family farms and more very large farms as there's been consolidation in the industry. We also have a problem that we have a shortage of young we have a shortage, of farmers in general, but in particular of young farmers in the United States. And so this is a graph that shows different counties throughout the US the share of beginning farmers. And so where you see the white, for example, that means less than 20% of the farmers are considered beginning farmers. And the term, by the way, as USDA defines it, would mean principal operators who've been on their current operations for 10 years or less. And so it's a real problem that we have a shortage of farmers overall, and we don't have enough young people entering the field to be able to make sure we're producing enough food, enough healthy food to feed Americans moving forward. Okay. So also want to point out that most subsidies funded through the Farm Bill are going to our wealthiest farms. And you don't need to get every detail out of this graph. I'll walk you through just a couple sort of takeaway points. Generally speaking, the largest farms in the US with the greatest farm household wealth represent just under 3% of all farms, but they receive more than a third of all commodity subsidies and almost that much of the insurance indemnities or payments. So if you look at the sets of bars on the left half of this graph, those are what are more so considered sort of the smaller family farms, and they are the larger share of all of the farms in the United States. If we look at the dark green bars, like the 18%, 42%, 25%. So they make up the bulk of farms in the United States, but they receive a very, very small share of the commodity payments and the crop insurance indemnities. And so this pattern of who is receiving subsidies is really contributing to that sort of consolidation, increase in size that I showed before, and making it really difficult for smaller farms, farms that are producing smaller quantities to be able to stay in business. And then federal agricultural investments also reflect and deepen structural inequalities. So we know that looking back at data from 2017, that white farmers have traditionally benefited more than Black or Indigenous farmers. So meaning that they receive much less in terms of the subsidies and the payments that I talked about on previous slides. Also own a much greater percentage of farmland in the United States. On this slide, I'm highlighting what is being grown on our planted acreage in the United States. So these are our top 10 commodities. I talked about that term before. So as you can see, corn is by far the largest. I just updated this graph the other day, by the way. So I believe last time I gave this presentation, soy and corn were both 35%. I just looked at the data on USDA's website, and as of August, it looks like the percentage of soy has gone down slightly. Regardless, you can still see corn, soy, wheat together make up the vast majority, with some of the others I mentioned before, like cotton, rice, etc., also making up the bulk. So these are the top commodities that were by the amount of farmland used to grow them. And then to talk for just a couple of slides about corn production in particular. So only about 10% of corn that we're growing in the United States is used for food. So almost 40%, used for food for humans. Maybe I should specify. Almost 40% are used for feed, to feed livestock. And then almost 30% is used to produce ethanol. We export more than 10% of the corn we produce. And then if you look in the bottom right, that is corn that ends up in the food supply. But if you look at some of the terms in that box on the bottom right, most of that corn is not the ears of corn that some of us enjoy buying at the farmer's market and eating over the summer. Most of that corn ends up as corn syrup and other derivatives used throughout our food supply, often in the more heavily processed foods that I think a lot of us are not necessarily recommending fill the majority of people's plates. And then this is an image from actually my book about the Farm Bill to just show kind of visually some of the different negative effects of this, quote, cornification of America that I talked about. So this huge amount of corn that we're growing that is being used for a variety of purposes has some very far-reaching negative effects. So certainly contributing to the high prevalence, ease of access to processed unhealthy foods, contributing to the increasing rates of obesity and chronic disease in the United States. We spend an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars in the United States. We have a lot of runoff of fertilizers and other chemicals that run off into water systems. And if you see the skull and crossbones in the Gulf of Mexico, you may have heard the term the dead zone before. So areas and bodies of water that have experienced a lot of runoff, in particular fertilizers, that leads to an overproduction of algae, and then fish and animals are not able to survive. So just to offer again several examples of the negative effects of this huge amount of corn that we're subsidizing and producing. Okay, and then briefly about some changes in our conservation spending. So our conservation spending in recent years has been deprioritizing some of the most effective, important outcomes for soil and climate. So I mentioned earlier how there are a couple of different categories or mechanisms of funding through the conservation programs in the conservation title. The Conservation Reserve Program is, again, that sort of set-aside program. And that is one that different organizations, including the Union of Concerned Scientists, would say leads to the greatest return on investment. But that has actually received less funding over the last couple of farm bills. And the proportion of conservation dollars spent on more of the working lands programs, which many people in the field would argue don't necessarily lead to the same environmental benefits. Those are receiving a higher proportion of funds. And then I'll note briefly that there are also entities that are not included in the Farm Bill, both human and non-human beings alike. So farm and food chain workers' well-being has largely been excluded, although there have been many advocates suggesting that the Farm Bill should include some sort of title focused on programs to support the workers themselves. And then there aren't specific programs, requirements, looking at really the treatment of animals. So the only law that codified farm animals entitlements exclude the Humane Slaughter Act excluded more than 95% of farmed animals. So to focus for a couple of slides now on nutrition. So our dietary guidelines in the United States are not aligned with the way we're subsidizing agriculture. So you may have sort of picked up on that trend based on what I've talked about so far. So I'm sure most of you have seen an image like the one on the left, the My Plate that accompanies the dietary guidelines that shows fruits and vegetables making up half of our plates. But if you look at the image on the right-hand side, this shows the breakdown of what types of foods are receiving subsidy dollars. And there have been a couple of different versions of this graph over time. I actually first saw it, I think Congresswoman Shelley Pingree shared it several years ago. And then this most recent version that I found is from an organization called Farm Action. So you can see that fruits and vegetables end up receiving just about 4% of our subsidy dollars, whereas the livestock and animal feed we can really see is getting the largest proportion there. So again, the dietary guidelines, what we as a country are recommending that people eat and what fills their plate does not align with the way we're subsidizing food production in the United States. And then I would argue that in part because of that, Of course, not the only reason. I realize there are other contributors, but in part, as a result of that, our diets, what Americans are actually eating, does not align with our dietary guidelines. So this is an image from our 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines. You may have seen this graph like this or this one before. So just to help explain a little bit what you're seeing, the dark blue bars represent the categories of foods for which Americans are not eating enough, or those really who are deficient. So as an example, if we look at total vegetables all the way on the left, we can see that roughly 90% of Americans are consuming vegetables below the recommended amount. And then if we look at whole grains, we see maybe 98 or 99% of Americans are deficient. And then if we look at the purple bars, so for example, refined grains, that bar shows you the proportion of Americans who are eating amounts above the recommendation. So maybe about 93, 94% of Americans are eating more refined grains than are recommended. And then briefly, just to offer a few examples of recent issues that are likely to affect the 2023 Farm Bill. So these are, this is not an exhaustive list, but what I could fit on a slide. So these are some topics that, again, you've probably heard about, read about over the last several of years, issues in our food system, and we're certainly hearing come up in the listening sessions and other events related to the 2023 Farm Bill that have been happening this year. So one, certainly being SNAP. You may know every time we get ready to sign a Farm Bill, there are always debates about SNAP, how to manage the very high amount of spending on the program. And so in the last couple or few years, we have certainly seen increases in food insecurity and shortages during the pandemic. We've also seen a substantial increase in benefits through thrifty food plan revisions that have led to a substantial increase in spending on the program. We've also seen food prices and food shortages caused by a few different factors. So we've had issues with drought, we had the war in Ukraine, export restrictions, high energy costs. And so those have led to increased commodity prices and food shortages that have impacted Americans and certainly others around the world. So climate change, we have seen through the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and other bills that have provided billions of dollars to fund programs to address climate change. So just as an aside, I guess I'm noting other bills that are funding climate change, so not necessarily saying those are requiring the Farm Bill to spend money on climate change, but just that there have been these increases sources of funding to address an issue that is also very closely related to a lot of what is funded by the Farm Bill and is a sign that through sort of Farm Bill discussions looking forward that it may become more of a priority. We've certainly seen the continued impacts of both droughts and floods in the United States, which have had negative effects on agricultural production, and then also various bills promoting resiliency and mitigation. Looking at labor, so we've seen shortages throughout the food supply chain. You may remember early in the pandemic, we saw poor conditions in meatpacking plants that led to thousands of cases and even closures of many plants. Consumer trends. So we have seen, again, during the pandemic, unpredictability, disruptive supply chains. We've also seen increased demand for meat and dairy alternatives, more reliance on technology, more direct-to-consumer outlets for small farmers. So that's really motivating maybe a lot of new players to be interested in advocacy and having a seat at the table in this Farm Bill, because we know that there is a growth in a lot of these companies producing some of these alternatives, and also alternatives to meat and dairy, but also elsewhere along the supply chain, trying to sort of connect the dots and get food to people in new and creative ways. More support for organic. So as an example, we recently spent $200 million for a new organic transition initiative, strengthening organic enforcement rule. And we do continue to see, just looking at sort of interest among consumers in America, increased spending and interest in organics. And then stimulus funding. So a lot of the stimulus bills during the pandemic ended up providing funding primarily toward big agribusiness, although in the American Rescue Plan, a portion was intended to be set aside to focus on disadvantaged farmers. So just sort of as another issue, this is an example of an op-ed, I guess it was a little over 2 years ago, that I published with my co-author. So food waste. So you may be aware there's a very significant increase in addressing food waste, I'd say through multiple parties throughout the country, for a variety of reasons. And we really saw as a country early in the pandemic an increased attention on food waste as we saw the disrupted supply chains, and sort of other factors going on. But at the same time, we saw an enormous increase in the problem of hunger and food insecurity. And so my co-author Dan and I wrote this op-ed to sort of make some recommendations, including what might be able to change through the Farm Bill to better help address both of these problems. And then just briefly, again, to return to SNAP, I mentioned early on that we've seen an increase in spending in recent history, and there were a couple of points in time I wanted to call out. So if we look at the graph on the right, I think, I mentioned before how we saw a big increase in spending in 2008 and a couple of years after that. But this graph, actually, you can see that 2021, 22, we saw another very significant increase. And that was partially related to the increased demand during the pandemic, but also really the Thrifty Food Plan revisions. And so the revision in the Thrifty Food Plan basically means that the families who are eligible get a larger amount of their benefits increase. So we're giving, in addition to there being more interest in the program overall, each participant is receiving more money. And so just to really show, I guess, as we're increasing more money, that means there are more eyes, more attention on the program, trying to understand, is it really necessary for us to be spending this much? Are there ways that we can be cutting down, being more efficient in the way that we're spending our money? So on this slide, I just want to offer some examples. I'm not necessarily saying I have the right answer, but just to give you examples of what some different advocates, experts, researchers, et cetera, would argue could or should be done to make sure that we're using the SNAP program as effectively, as efficiently as possible, and really not only optimizing diet for participants, but also their health outcomes. So looking for ways to better align SNAP and Medicaid. The eligibility requirements are not exactly the same, certainly, but there is a substantial amount of overlap between SNAP eligible, potential participants eligible for SNAP, and then Medicaid beneficiaries. Another example might be better connecting recipients to food hubs, food sharing networks to help make their dollars go as far as possible. Many people are interested in better supporting collection and sharing of data and analyses on what SNAP beneficiaries are purchasing, and then be able to use those data to decide how can we maybe provide incentives, disincentives. There are certainly a lot of debates about what restrictions potentially should be imposed. And then there continue to be some advocates who would say perhaps SNAP should be removed from the Farm Bill entirely. So again, I'm not saying I have the right answer, but these are several ideas that you'll hear different advocates propose. So after all that I've shared today, you can see that there are some changes that I would argue are really necessary to the Farm Bill to address some of these issues. So one might be imposing real income limits for subsidy recipients. We do have, in theory, limits for the commodity programs, but the crop insurance subsidies actually do not have any sort of associated limit on who is eligible for subsidies. And so many people are arguing we need to impose limits to help address the continued increase in spending. Another example might be imposing real compliance requirements for implementing conservation practices for the recipients of our federal subsidies. And then the last example for now I'll mention is increasing that whole farm revenue program that I mentioned before and support for diversified farms. So after that, then I'll mention that I have a few examples of positive impacts that you all can make as experts in your work in local food systems and advocacy. So regardless of what you do, what type of organization you work for, or if you want to engage in any of these as a volunteer. So I would say that any of you on our call today can be publishing and sharing your findings. So that might mean publishing research to help build an evidence base for valuable programs, or maybe if you have evidence to show shortcomings in these programs. But you can also be publishing blogs, op-eds, such as the couple that I shared before, to share important ideas to help impact what is happening with the next Farm Bill. You can learn, so coming to today's summit is a great way to do that. Also staying up to date on information about the bill and current subsidies by reading reports from the Congressional Research Service, a couple other organizations, and I will share links at the end. The National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, the Environmental Working Group, and Farm Action are a few examples of organizations that have great information. You can testify, you can submit written or oral testimonies at hearings. You can advocate, so you can write to your legislators, and that can happen at the national level. That can also happen at the local level. You can spend your own dollars at markets and farms that invest in local economies and help to keep those small family farms in business. You can support young people entering farming, sharing pertinent opportunities, connecting them with mentors. And then another example might be partnering. So if any of you work in organizations that are involved in institutional food procurement, so looking for ways to partner with local food hubs or producers, again, to help keep dollars local and keep those small farms in business. A few recommendations for you. So you can pass, for your audiences. So whatever type of audience you're working with, you can pass along information from the organizations I mentioned. I do think my book is a great resource as well. You can offer recommendations about local farms, community-supported agriculture, etc., to your colleagues, to friends, the public. Educate about both the environmental and the nutritional benefits of eating fresh, local, wholesome foods. Educate about how to cook with those foods, remembering sometimes that even means frozen and canned if that's what people have access to. And then for your own work, when and where appropriate, connecting with pertinent Farm Bill resources and programs. And then my last couple of slides, wanted to talk briefly about opportunities for advocacy. And so as I've talked about today, there are a lot of different ways that the Farm Bill impacts our country, whether it be the environmental effects, the human health effects, economic effects, et cetera. And so when we think about all of these different impacts as we're engaging in advocacy, depending on the audience that you're trying to engage, it can be really helpful to try to bring in a variety of stakeholders and call attention to these sort of variety of far-reaching effects and the way that advancing or rather improving the way that we fund these Farm Bill programs can help to advance shared priorities. Again, to really make sure we're being as efficient as possible and leading to the best possible outcomes. And so again, really elevating the importance of food and food systems in helping to bring improvement in all of these issues. And so I think this brings me then to my last slide. So to reiterate, really, I think when we think about shifting the Farm Bill, so the way that we are subsidizing agriculture and funding these different programs to try to address some of the negative effects that we're seeing in the environment, in human health, and public health, et cetera, we can reorient our Farm Bill, our food and farming policy to help advance these shared priorities toward more sustainable opportunities for farmers, universal nutrition security, and justice across our food system and supply chain. And so a slide here to share some examples of recommended reading, as I've talked about some of these examples already today. And I think with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Christina. That was very rich. A lot to think about.